few years ago, when working and managing a district nursing team in London, myself and the team had the pleasure of looking after a lovely man who, although time and various medical ailments had caught up with his body, he had the naughtiest, most undefeated spirit I've ever known. He was an absolute gentleman with the female nurses, and they loved to visit him, but he would always save his naughtiest gay love life stories for me. Although he knew I was heterosexual, there would always be stories waiting for me every visit like the following. During World War II, he'd befriended a black GI who'd left his newlywed wife back at home in the USA. On returning to London with his wife and daughter in their mid-50s, the GI and family had met up in a London pub with him. When the GI had gone off to buy some drinks, his wife said, "Thank you very much for looking after my husband during the war." At this point, my patient looked up at me, winked, and said, "I was more than looking after him, I was fucking him." And as he had such comic timing, I could never accept a cup of coffee from him, as I knew I would end up laughing and potentially spluttering over his posh carpet. I'm also glad to say he never told the wife the part he told me. He sadly died not long afterwards, but never once did I ever hear him bemoan about living in a time when homosexuality was against the law in the UK, and this only changed in 1967. We now live in a time which the majority of the world accept that who you are is who you are, and you fancy who you fancy. We certainly see a different world today. But in today's episode, we return to a time when things were completely different. Hi and welcome back to the Historical Crimes and Criminals podcast. I'm Steve, your host, and we're living in such unprecedented times under severe lockdowns that I've decided to increase my output during this lockdown period to 2 episodes a week. In the 18th century, words like gay, homosexual, and indeed LGBT were not known or used. Let's take a step back a little bit further. During the reign of Henry VIII, in 1533, the Buggery Act was passed, and it defined buggery as an unnatural sexual act against the will of God and man. In law, it was sometimes a bit of a hard act to prove, as it had to be shown that penetration and ejaculation had occurred. Therefore, men were often charged with the lesser crime of assault with sodomitical intent. This carried lesser charges, which were generally fines, imprisonment, or pillory. But buggery would remain a capital offence until 1861, and you could be hanged for it. The law, however, was very inconsistent, and it would sometimes pass lesser sentences depending on your position in society, as seen by the first person convicted of the act. Nicholas Udall was a playwright, and he was the headmaster of Eton College. In 1541, he was charged with sexually abusing his pupils. In Udall's case, the sentence was commuted to imprisonment, and he was released in less than a year. He would incredibly go on to be the headmaster of Westminster School. Whilst in court, the accused would be described as sodomites, but in the common parlance of the time of the 17th and 18th century, homosexual men were referred to as mollies. There are 2 main schools of thought about where the word originated. Molly is the pet name of the female forename Mary. Clipped a little, the word moll had a connotation of designating a lower class girl or woman, and usually a prostitute. And from this, we see Defoe's character, Moll Flanders. When applied to a man, they were generally called mollies, and they were usually homosexual prostitutes, but this eventually just became known as all gay men. The second school of thought comes from the Latin mollis, which translated to English has a few meanings, including easy, soft, weak, tender, sensitive, and effeminate. In a 1767 French-English dictionary by Thomas Nugent, the word molly was present, but simply defined as a sodomite, without effeminate connotations. In 2017, an Office of National Statistics survey returned that 2.3% of British males identified as homosexual, with that increasing to 2.6% in London. Using this data, and given the population of London, around 1700, of at least 600,000 people, there certainly would be the need for a significant clandestine gay underground scene. And since sexual preference has no occupational, ethnic, or class distinctions, many meeting places and houses were discreetly tucked away for those in the know. They were known as molly houses. As a general rule, they were known about by the establishment, but most took the view of, if it doesn't harm me, why should I bother? And there was probably enough males of homosexual persuasion in positions of power to ensure it stayed that way. There were around 30 molly houses in London in the early 1700s. Some were sophisticated establishments, whilst some molly houses were very simple. For instance, nothing more than someone's room where men met each other, in which case the owner of the room would supply containers of ale. Moreover, in some cases, a molly house was just a room in a standard drinking establishment, such as the back room of the tavern. But that was the low end of the market, and it was common for men at the more established molly houses to wear women's clothes, and indeed, to this end, costumes could be hired. Essentially, the mollies would turn up in their normal clothing and hire a costume for the evening, should they wish. It could also speak and act in typically feminine ways, and to this end, some had alternative names such as Plump Nellie, Primrose Mary, Aunt May, Susan Guzzle, Aunt England, and the Duchess of Chamomile. But not everyone at the time had a favourable impression of the mollies, as we see in 1709, Ned Ward, the writer of the London Spy. There are a particular gang of sodomitical wretches in this town who call themselves the mollies and are so far degenerated from all masculine deportment or manly exercises that they rather fancy themselves women. They imitate all the little vanities that custom has reconciled to the female sex, affecting to speak, walk, tattle, curtsy, cry, scold, and to mimic all manner of effeminacy. They commit such indecencies of lewd women that they may tempt each other by such immodest freedoms to commit these odious bestialities that ought forever to be without a name. Jonathan Wild was a thief-taker in London and a man who would extort the mollies, and he was quite happy to play both sides of the law. He would later describe the molly houses as follows. On arrival, the mollies would take on a female persona, have a female name, and affect female mannerisms and speech. The men called each other my dear, and hugging, kissing, and tickling each other as if it was a mixture of wanton males and females and assuming effeminate voices and airs. They would have marriage ceremonies, often a euphemism for sexual intercourse, but sometimes actual ceremonies between a Molly and his male lover, reenacted to symbolise their partnership and commitment to each other. And there were also such things as mock birth rituals, during which a man dressed in a nightgown, pretending to be a woman, given birth to a baby, assisted by fellow Mollies as midwives. The most famous Molly house in London was Mother Clapp's. It was the house of Margaret Clapp. It was next to the Bunch of Grapes Tavern in Field Lane in Holborn, and it ran from 1724 to 1726. Mother Clapp's hosted 30 or 40 persons every night, and more on Sundays. All rooms had beds. The doors were guarded to ensure only Mollies gain entrance and no one mistakenly tried to enter. Mother Clapp always presided over the meetings at her coffee house and would pop over to the Bunch of Grapes to purchase beer, wine and pies for her customers. The chief worry for every Molly house was the reformation of Manners Society, and they sought to eliminate vice and immorality by targeting prostitutes, Sabbath breakers and sodomites. In the years between 1699 to 1721, there was roughly one sodomy trial every 3 years, with no one ever being found guilty. But then the society made a point of targeting perceived vices, and they used various tactics to achieve this goal, with coercion, spies, bribes, and immunity from prosecution for turning king's evidence. It worked, and the numbers of prosecutions soared, with 1,363 prosecutions taking place in the 2 years of 1726 to 27. And this is what made Mother Clapp's the most infamous Molly house in recorded history. The society was always looking for evidence for which they could bring prosecutions and close establishments down. And unknown to Mother Clapp, 2 homosexual informants, a jilted lover, Mark Partridge, and a prostitute called Thomas Newton, provided society with information regarding activities, to which it brought Mother Clapp's to the attention of authorities, and they placed it under surveillance. On the 17th of February 1726, it was raided, and Mother Clapp, along with 40 men, were arrested. At the time, several men were seized in women's apparel, and they were conveyed to the Compter. Next morning, they were carried before the Lord Mayor in the same dress they were taken in. Some people were completely rigged in gowns, petticoats, headcloths, fine lace shoes, and fur scarves. Some had Red Riding Hood costumes, some were dressed like milkmaids, others shepherd dresses with green hats, waistcoats, petticoats. Others had their face patched and painted and wore extensive hoop petticoats, which had been very lately introduced and were very fashionable. The case against Margaret and her customers relied on the testimony of Bow Street runner Samuel Stevens, who had attended Mother Clapp's on a number of occasions, posing as Mark Partridge's husband. He testified that sometimes they'd sit on each other's laps, kissing in a lewd manner and using their hands indecently. Then they would get up and dance and make curtsies and mimic the voices of women. "Oh fie, sir, pray sir, dear sir, Lord, how can I serve you so? I swear I'll cry out, you are a wicked devil." Most of the men arrested were subsequently released without charge due to a lack of evidence, but 3 were convicted of sodomy and sentenced to be hanged at Tyburn, particularly after the testimony of Newton, who had sex with these men and had taken King's evidence to save himself from prosecution. The three men were Thomas Wright, a 32-year-old woolcomber, William Griffin, a 43-year-old upholsterer, and Gabriel Lawrence, a 43-year-old milkman. In the Newton testimony against Wright, he said, "Last January the 12th, the prisoner had carnal use of my body at his own home in Christopher's Alley in Moorfields." The three men were hanged at Tyburn on the 9th of May, 1726. Mother Clapp was found guilty of keeping a house of disrepute and sentenced to stand in a pillory at Smithfield, where she was severely treated by the mob. She also had to pay a fine and suffer 2 years' imprisonment. There are no records to know what happened to Mrs. Clapp. Another well-documented case from 1728 comes from East London, and it's a raid on a Molly house in Whitechapel. The Molly house was owned by Miss Muff, also known as Jonathan Muff, and it stood in Black Lion Yard. The yard no longer exists, but Black Lion House now stands on the site at 45 Whitechapel Road. On the 5th of October 1728, a news item about the raid read, "9 male ladies arrested." On Sunday night last, a constable with proper assistance searched the house of Jonathan Muff, alias Miss Muff, in Black Lion Yard near Whitechapel Church, where they apprehended 9 male ladies, including the man of the house. They were secured that night in New Prison, and Monday morning they were examined before Justice Jackson. John Blake Colland was committed to Newgate, where he was charged on oath while committing the detestable sin of sodomy. Of the 9 arrested, we know that 2 were whipped, 1 was fined, 2 were acquitted, and 1, whose name was given as Thomas Mitchell, attempted to end his life in prison. His attempt was described as the following. He attempted, and near accomplished, destroying himself and cutting the great artery of his left arm almost asunder, but by immediate help of some eminent surgeons, he was preserved, though at the point of death, through the great effusion of blood. It was with raids like these that essentially drastically reduced the number of Molly houses from the late 1720s, and certainly for the next few decades, until we see a slower re-emergence in the 1750s. But not everyone hid in the shadows, and there was one very famous Molly called Princess Seraphina, and she wore her feminine identity beyond these secret meeting places and into her public life. We know of her because in 1732 she brought a case against a man for stealing her clothes. Her neighbour, Mary Poplett, described her with the following testimony. "I have known Her Highness a pretty while. I've seen her several times in women's clothes. She commonly used to wear a white gown, a scarlet cloak, with her hair frizzled and curled all round her forehead, and then she would flutter her fan and make such fine curtsies that you would not have known her from a woman. She takes great delight in balls and masquerades, and always chooses to appear them in female dress, so that she might have the satisfaction of dancing with fine gentlemen. Her Highness lives with Mr. Tull in the Eagle Court in the Strand, and calls him her master, because she was a nurse to him and his wife when they were both in salivation. Salivation was a mercurial cure for syphilis. But the princess is rather Mr. Tull's friend, rather than his domestic service. I've never heard that she had other name than Princess Seraphina." It would, however, remain a slow progression towards a modern society where people can be who they want to be and not judged, castigated, criminalised for their sexual orientation, and indeed now, with gay pride celebrations all over the world, and the recognition of equality, it's certainly one small step for mankind. Well, that's it for another episode of the Historical Crimes and Criminals podcast. I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please leave a review, and indeed, give me a shout out on your own social media. And until next time, bye bye.